Welcome to our third study on Lamentations, and today we're looking at chapter 4. The past is another country. They do things differently there. So said L.P. Hartley. And how true is that of the old normal that we left behind on the 24th of March? Can we easily go back to it when lockdown becomes open up? Will the post-COVID generation have a totally different take on normality? These are actually the kind of questions that we're getting into in Lamentations chapter 4, because this chapter gives us a very shrewd analysis of the old normal in Judah. At least the old normal among the trendsetters and the moneymakers of the old regime. You might have heard of Lord Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi. He's just written a new book called Morality, Recovering the Common Good. It was, of course, written in pre-COVID days, but his analysis is timely. And his book is about what he calls our relentless preoccupation with me, about how the pursuit of wealth and power has undermined community. What was it like for the people at the top in pre-exile Judah? Well, chapter 4 verses 1 to 8 give you a flavour. Gold, fine food, affluence, optimism. We'll look at these in detail in a moment. But what about the nobodies? The people at the bottom of the pile? The ones the Babylonians left in Judah because they were, well, worthless. There's almost a throwaway line in Jeremiah chapter 52 and verse 16. It says there, Nebuchadnezzar left behind in Jerusalem the rest of the poor people to work the vineyards and the fields. Actually, we'll find in the next talk that they worked the land rather well. And in God's sight, these people had real value. You see, Judah was occupied by Babylon, but it was still in God's hand. And these people, the baldricks at the bottom, they became his caretakers and his trustees. Blessed are the meek, said Jesus, for they shall inherit the earth. And yes, God was in Babylon with the exiles who'd lost everything. But he was also still in Israel with the nobodies who never had anything. The people for whom life under the Babylonians was not a lot different to the way it had ever been. This chapter has got a lot to say about spiritual, social and material idolatry. Long before the exile, Jeremiah had warned the nation, people of many nations will pass by this city and ask, why has the Lord done such a thing to this great city? And the answer will be, because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord their God and worshipped and served other gods. You find that in Jeremiah chapter 22 and verse 8. I've got 3 words for you today. First of all, a word to the affluent about their lifestyle. A word to the affluent about their lifestyle. And that's in chapter 4, verses 1 to 10. Read these verses in detail and you'll get the picture. On their way to Babylon, they hid their gold in their clothing as they were being herded off. But their clothes are now in tatters, and you can't eat gold. They'd dined nightly in expensive restaurants. Now they beg in the streets. They'd belonged to exclusive gyms and country clubs, and now those bronzed torsos are shriveled, and their skin is black. Their dietary disorders came from obesity in the old days, but now they're boiling weeds to eat. And worst of the lot, hunger has driven the wealthy elite to cannibalism. If you want more detail on top-end Israel before the exile, read Isaiah chapter 3, verses 16 to 26. That's about lifestyle. Read Isaiah chapter 5, verses 8 to 10. That's about top-end market housing. Read Isaiah chapter 5, verses 11 to 12. That's about non-stop partying. It's a familiar picture. But what's the take-home message for these wealthy people? Is it that wealth is sinful? Well, actually, no. Because Abraham was a very wealthy man. And in the New Testament, there's plenty of teaching about the proper use of wealth, especially the Epistle of James. But come back to Jonathan Sachs's point. Power can corrupt the powerful, and wealth can desensitize the wealthy. Did you get that strange reference in chapter 4 and verse 3 to ostriches? No, it's not that they buried their head in the sand before the crisis. You get the answer in Job chapter 39, verses 13 to 17. And it's this. Ostriches trample on their eggs and abandon their young. And that's a powerful word about the affluent in Israel before the crisis of the exile. When this COVID crisis subsides, there will be questions to ask. Who have we valued and devalued in our society? How should we be using our national wealth? What do we really value? What things really matter in a crisis? And what's our security based on? Really, these are spiritual as well as social or political questions. That's the first word to the affluent about their lifestyle. Here's the second. It's a word to Judah's kings about their power. And you get that in verses 11 through to 16. When this pandemic subsides, there are bound to be questions to answer. Boris Johnson has admitted that much. Here is something that started in faraway China. No, they say it'll never come here. So, with this in mind, look at verse 12. Here were kings in denial about God's warnings. In 2 Kings chapter 20, even good King Hezekiah said, well, it'll not happen in my time. And in Jeremiah chapter 36, you find King Jehoiakim scoffing, fake news. You remember, as the message was read to him, he threw each page in the fire. And then he threw the messenger in the prison to rot. Listen, when kings sign up for post-truth and believe their own fake news, that's a sign that judgment might not be far away. And an injection of bleach won't take it away either. But you ask me, how did Judah's kings get the nation into this mess? Well, verses 13 to 16 take you in even deeper. It was in part because their spiritual advisors led them astray. Look at verse 13. Does that hint that human sacrifice had even happened? Well, maybe not, because in Ezekiel chapter 22, verses 1 to 4, shedding blood is a way to describe idolatry. But whatever. When kings and priests are corrupted, the nation is in danger. And when the temple is doomed, the palace isn't far behind. Look at verses 14 to 16. The priests themselves had become ceremonially unclean. All the priests, even the high priest who had access to the most holy place, those who had interceded with God for the people, and now verse 16 says the face of God has scattered them. Jeremiah chapter 52 gives you the chilling story of the last priests in the exile. Seraiah the chief priest, Zephaniah the priest next in rank, the three doorkeepers, there at Riblah in the land of Hamath, the king had them all executed. Fast forward to our own day. Think of inside traders defrauding their companies for their own benefit. Think of internet criminals exploiting the public sphere of the corona crisis. Think of politicians abusing their privileged positions. Think of churchmen bringing their calling and their churches into disrepute. And in every case, public confidence is undermined. At the exile, God drew a line, and he taught the nation's leaders hard lessons. Lessons that could never have been learned in any other way. It's sad. But listen, is that it? Is there any forgiveness? Are corrupt leaders beyond hope? Is there hope for any of us? Well, thankfully, that's not what it says. Young King Jehoiakim, he was the first of the kings of Judah to be carried off to exile. He rotted in jail for years. But actually in Jeremiah chapter 52 and verse 31, we're told that eventually he was set free. It says there, Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes, and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table, the king of Babylon. Day by day, the king of Babylon gave him a regular allowance as long as he lived, until the day of his death. I don't know why that was. I can only assume that in prison, that young man matured and came to repentance. A bit like the late Charles Colson, whose career in American government ended in jail and disgrace after the Watergate crisis back in the 1970s. In prison, that man came to faith, and he founded Prison Fellowship and has spent the rest of his life sharing the gospel with prisoners. Or take Jonathan Aitken, cabinet minister under John Major, convicted 20 years ago of perjury and perverting the course of justice. He did time. In prison, he was converted. Today, he's a Church of England clergyman and a full-time prison chaplain. Listen, none of us dare tell God that he has no right to show mercy. That's a lesson Jonah had to learn the hard way. And it might be a lesson for us as well. So the last word, finally and briefly, a word to the nation about restoration. And you'll find that in chapter 4, verses 17 to 22. Those last days before the Babylonian invasion, oh gosh, they were a nightmare. They'd heard the rumble of the approaching armies. Do you hear it in verse 18? They ran straight into an ambush. You see that in verse 19. And their king Zedekiah met a fearful end. That's verse 20. The man whose motto was, "Make Judah great again." Well, he was carried off in chains to Babylon. His sons were butchered in front of him. And that was the last thing he saw, because they blinded him. And they threw him into prison for the rest of his life. So that's it then. No more to be said. What a waste of time and parchment writing this miserable letter. No, indeed. Because the last word in chapter 4 is a word of hope for the nation. You see, Judah's enemies crowed with glee at the exile. And back in chapter 1 and verse 21, we saw how the exiles cried to God to deal with them. And in particular, chapter 4, verses 21 and 22 singles out the Edomites, the people who had already kicked Israel when they were down. Way back in the tiny book of Obadiah, you read this prophetic warning. Listen to it. You should not look down on your brother in the day of his misfortune, or rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction. The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done to Judah, so it will be done to you. Those who insulted God's people were poking the apple of his eye. God didn't let his own people off, but he didn't let them go either. And after a hard road of discipline, there was a destination of repentance and restoration. Did you catch a phrase we missed back in verse 11? God has fully used up his wrath. There was a limit to the punishment. There were 3 deportations to Babylon, no more. Nebuchadnezzar was the agent of God's wrath, but he was kept in check. Babylon were the great conquerors, but they in turn were conquered by the Persians. And with the Persians came a new policy that paved the way for a return. That's a good way to end today's study. God's anger is limited, but his compassion and his mercy are limitless. You get that in Psalm 103, verses 8 to 12. You probably know it. And of course, it's the story of the cross as well. There's a modern worship song that says this: till on that cross, when Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied, for every sin on him was laid. Here, in the death of Christ, I stand. And really, that's the only place where people and nations can ever stand. Join us next time, please, for the final study in this short series. Thank you for watching.